Hello, BookTube.
Good morning, readers. It's Tilly from Tilly Shelf.
And Ross from Skeleton Linkmouth's books, or is it Tilly from Tilly Shelf? And
I don't know. I'm getting very confused. We're at a festival, so there's a little bit of noise in the background. But we thought, while we're together, obviously we've got to make some BookTube videos, so we're going to do some talking about Jane Austen July,
which is
an absolute highlight of the reading year.
And how you sucked me into BookTube.
I said, why don't you want to read more Jane Austen and talk about Jane Austen to like-minded people?
Yeah.
So this is kind of like a wrap-up and highlights. So we're going to work our way through the prompts created by
our lovely hosts.
Our hosts, Katie at Books and Things, Claudia at Spinster's Library, and Marissa at Blatantly Bookish. I nearly managed to say all of those without stumbling, but somehow didn't quite get there.
You didn't get a lot of sleep.
Yeah.
And the number one prompt and the only sort of essential every year is to read one of the
full-length major works.
The major works, as it were. The 6 major works plus Lady Susan. And you overachieve every year.
Every year I can't stop at one. So actually I started ahead of the game in June, and I read Northanger Abbey, and then I also read Sense and Sensibility twice, and then I read Emma. I read them all as audiobooks, so it's not as bad as it sounds. I was listening to Northanger Abbey kind of in the evenings to like settle down before bed, and listening to Sense and Sensibility and Emma while I was doing my gardening.
Okay, that excuse is over. So I only reread one, and
She's good. She obeys the rules.
And the one that I reread was Northanger Abbey, and I was intrigued to reread that because I think it's possibly the longest since I've reread Northanger Abbey compared to any of the others, and there's a tendency when I reread a Jane Austen for it to sort of suddenly be my favourite.
Yeah, it moves up the rankings automatically. Yeah.
And I have to say that didn't actually happen with Northanger Abbey.
Have you yet read any of the sort of the Anne Radcliffe's, like the Mysteries of Udolpho or anything?
Yeah,
you have.
Of course, I've read the Mysteries of Udolpho.
Of course, she's read the Mysteries of Udolpho.
I haven't read a lot of that sort of thing. I specifically read that to better appreciate Northanger Abbey. And I really enjoy it. It's a lovely book, but for me, it's slightly less rich.
Yeah, it's maybe got less layers to it. I just find it really endearing, and I think in many ways it's the best. Well, you know, that's this kind of statement that you start to make and then you think that's not true. I was going to say it's the best romance in a way.
Because Henry Tilney is a really disappointing. One of the weaknesses of the book for me is that he never comes to life. Whereas the Thorpes, I really like the Thorpes. They're great characters.
The problem with Northanger Abbey actually is it doesn't have all of the different levels of conflict. So there's never in every other book there's always a bit more of a question about what's going to happen to the heroine. But I know you say you love the Thorpes, but John Thorpe is never a realistic prospect for Catherine, so the only male figure for her is Henry Tilney, so you know that one way or another it's got to work out with him. There's no you know, what's going to happen with Colonel Fitzwilliam, what's going to happen with Mr. Wickham, what's going to happen with Mr. Elliot. There's no alternative romantic interest for Catherine Morland, which does affect the
you're right. So it takes out some of the tension. So it's more the Thorpe plot is more about Catherine growing up a bit and becoming a bit less naive about people.
It's very much a coming of age novel in a way that Pride and Prejudice isn't really, because it's about a woman who's already
fully formed,
but needs to alter her ways of thinking, but isn't necessarily still growing up. If that makes sense. So anyway, that was Northanger Abbey.
So that was Northanger Abbey. You enjoyed rereading Sense and Sensibility, obviously, because you did it twice.
Yeah, I did it twice. I wanted to kind of look into the details a little bit more. You know, while it was all still fresh in my mind.
Because I think Sense and Sensibility is often people's least favourite, but I have quite an affection for it.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. The male leads are fairly weak. Like Edward Ferrars. Much as you can see what Eleanor sees in him, he's not really the kind of... if it was your best friend, you'd be saying, are you sure?
You can do better.
Are you sure you want to marry this guy?
And then Colonel Brandon is a lovely character.
Yeah.
A really lovely, rich, interesting character to read about, but you don't really feel that wonderful about Marianne ending up with him.
Yeah, and even Jane Austen says, with no feelings other than strong gratitude, which is something that they've felt the need to change in the adaptations. Often they say that she has fallen in love with him, but and she says no feelings other than strong gratitude. Marianne marries him, which I suppose makes more sense in the marriage climate of the time.
Indeed.
Although it does go against a lot of what Jane Austen seems to almost argue for in her other writing.
Yeah.
So, Sense and Sensibility.
So,
and Emma.
Lovely Emma. Lovely Emma.
So
now,
we've been talking about Emma yesterday.
Yes.
I've got I made a video on my channel talking about Emma being vexed, basically.
Vexed and distressed. Yes.
And you were upset about how people are maligning Emma.
Yes. So I've noticed this year, 2 or 3 videos where people have talked about their favourite Jane Austen heroines, and put Emma down at the bottom as and say, she's really snobby and she's really selfish and she's
which in fairness she is, she's also
and specifically the lovely Elizabeth of Bouquins and Books did this lovely series of ranking the novels by the on different kind of criteria, and then adding the totals up again. It's a good. I'll link below to her the first of those. But she said exactly. She said, Jane Austen set out to write a character that nobody will like but her, and she's right. I didn't like her.
But I sometimes have at times found Emma a little bit difficult, because in many ways I find her almost too familiar, because I know that I've had times when I've been a little bit too judgmental or a little bit too bossy, or not maybe managed social relationships perfectly, and that's exactly what Emma does. And she kind of reflects a lot of people, and more so than the perfection of an Anne Elliot,
or Eleanor Dashwood even. Yeah. She's very. But so for me, she's a very real character with sort of lots of sides to her personality.
And I think we were talking about how you've got to appreciate the fact that she's had no real equal relationships ever in her life. She's lost her mother very young.
Yes, she lost and which people, let's say, nothing bad's ever happened to Emma. She lost her mother, for goodness sake.
What I meant was nothing bad's happened to her in the course of the book. What she goes through it doesn't match the...
So her sister, she doesn't. They're not really close.
They're not close.
Her older sister is not
compared to the sister relationships that other Austen heroines have.
Yes. And Austen writes lovely sister relationships. Obviously, one presumes because she and Cassandra were so close. So.
Yeah, but Isabella's quite absent from the story.
So Isabella's absent. Then her mother substitute is a paid substitute.
And also
a lovely one.
Yeah, and not there as a friend. Nominally there to instruct her.
Yeah.
With or without success.
Yeah. She doesn't have a friend.
There's no one of there's no one of her social level, or no one that she sees at her social level in Highbury at all. We don't get any sense that she's grown up with playing with other children,
because the other women that she socialises with are more like her father's friends.
Yeah, so they're a generation older than she is.
So the one that should be her friend is Jane Fairfax, but obviously she's moved away, and then she comes back, and there's the competition.
And Jane Fairfax obviously has had that social interaction. She's had a very close friend. She's had
so much more life experience and
exposure to London society,
seen the world and society much more than Emma has.
So it's no wonder that Emma feels a little bit inadequate sometimes.
Yeah. She's had a very constrained life, and then she sort of adopts Harriet and
thinks that she's in a position to teach Harriet when she's not aware of her own sort of limitations, I suppose.
Yeah.
And Harriet's had, because she's had the Martin sisters, and she's grown up in a school environment. Yeah. Harriet, in many ways, is portrayed as this kind of slightly socially inept figure, but she's probably a lot more kind of clued up than Emma.
In some ways. Yeah.
Maybe not to kind of...
Yeah. So I feel like poor old Emma. She's well off. But she's
got other disadvantages.
She does have, her emotional life has not been entirely straightforward. And her father.
You identified her father as when we did the Jane Austen July tag. You said he was the character that you love to hate.
Yeah, and he but you know, she is incredibly kind and patient and supportive to her father, to the point of saying, you know, that she'll only marry Mr. Knightley if they moves in with her father. And he is to me, he's a very manipulative man, and he does constrain and limit her life, Emma's life.
Yeah, he does.
So,
and thinks that he's doing it in the best way. Thinks that he's.
But it's all about him, really, isn't it? Yeah. So there we go. That's my defence of Emma. Yeah.
So that's taken us 10 minutes to do one prompt.
So we better go a bit faster. Moving on
to the shorter works. That's the next prompt, is to read a not a complete novel, but something else that Jane Austen's written. And we both read some of her letters,
which are very interesting and entertaining.
And there's a lot of them, so you've got to just read a couple every year.
Yeah. I've got a big fat book, and I'll gradually work the way through. And it's a chance to get to know Jane.
Yeah, and you get
better.
A bit more of her personality. You get a really good idea of what her sense of humour is like, and then you can see that feeding into the books.
Yes.
And also, like, where she's maybe not using the full extent of her sense of humour in the books. It's at times very dark humour in her letters.
Acerbic and One of the things that we know, because we have the letters, and it's great we have so many, even though Cassandra destroyed a number apparently, is we know about things that she enjoyed.
Yes. And books that she read.
Which leads us to the next prompt. See, I'm moving faster now. Which is to read a Jane Austen contemporary novel, or we were given the alternative this year of reading a historical fiction set in that period. So, but I read, we both slightly cheated.
Yeah, a little bit.
Though in that the book that I read was by Laurence Sterne, who died before Jane Austen was born, but only like a decade or something. But The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman, is definitely a book that Jane Austen read and was an influence on her, I would say. So it felt fair enough.
Did you enjoy it?
I really enjoyed it, but it is a book that I think not everyone would enjoy.
Yeah.
Because in some ways it's very modern and experimental in style. Yeah, so it's very, very digressive. I mean, to an extreme. So, you know, this is the life and opinions in theory of Tristram Shandy. It takes about we start with his conception. We really do. Okay. in a less pornographic way than that sounds. and you know, it takes about half the book to get him born. Okay. And with a lot of discussion of midwifery and obstetrics.
Okay, well that actually sounds quite interesting.
But it's one of those books where the author kind of interjects a lot, and those moments, you know, you get just those odd moments in Austen's books when she does that, and it sort of kind of quite takes you by surprise, because most of the time she doesn't. If you know what I mean.
Yes, I mean that's maybe we can come on to that a little bit, but it doesn't take me by surprise, because I feel like it fits very naturally into the flow of her writing. But carry on.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
but more awkward in other books, I think.
Yeah. No. But what I mean is like if you'd read something like Tristram Shandy, that would seem a natural
progression
thing. Yeah. So she does just a little bit of that in a nice way. It's very funny in places, and you can see, you know, I can see why she would have enjoyed reading it.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that in Tristram Shandy, Sterne's really good at writing kind of eccentric, slightly over the top characters.
Yeah.
And you can see, so like going back to say Emma's father, Mr. Woodhouse, is sort of hypochondria, say.
Yeah.
So that kind of character, like Sterne does a sort of like a more exaggerated version, but you can see them. So I really enjoy it.
You can see a more exaggerated version of characters like Mr. Woodhouse in something like Sanditon, where she's not been back through and done the editing.
Yes.
And almost like in the editing, she's it appears to have toned down a lot of her characters.
Yeah.
So that they still have that kind of those features, but aren't quite as overbearing and
Yes.
are more true to life, I suppose.
As exactly. So
So a good
I
choice.
really enjoyed it. I'm really glad I read it.
I went in the other direction, so I didn't actually read this for Jane Austen July, but this year I've read Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, which was published in 1847, so that's 30 years after Jane Austen died. But I think that you can really see the influence of Austen on writers of the Victorian era, and
particularly the early Victorians.
Yeah, the early Victorians, because he set this book in the Napoleonic Wars, so in Jane Austen's time period, and you've got like fantastic characters like Becky Sharp, who's really she's looking out for herself, and in the story that's made to seem like she's a bit of a villain, but actually, you know, in many ways she's very, very savvy and very intelligent, and thinking, you know, how can I manage my life, can I get through my life when I start with absolutely nothing? And the only way to do that for her is, you know, marriages, manipulation, a little bit of petty crime, and I think that Becky Sharp is just like a fantastic development of a character like Lucy Steele, and it really builds on
Isabella Thorpe.
Or Isabella Thorpe, more so Lucy Steele,
More Lucy Steele,
because Lucy Steele's successful.
Yes.
Isabella Thorpe doesn't quite have the finesse to carry off what she starts. Lucy Steele ends up married to the guy that's got all of the money settled on him, and ends up, you know, best friends with Mrs. Ferrers and having advantages like later on in life, and that ability to charm and that ability to persuade people that you are like this innocent, much maligned individual that Lady Susan has as well.
Yes, absolutely.
And I think that it's almost like Thackeray read Lucy Steele and thought, you know, can I take this to extreme? Even to the name almost, Steele and Sharp.
Steele and Sharp.
I think
That's true.
There's a definite tribute there. And then in contrast, you've got this Amelia Sedley, who is more of a kind of like a, maybe not exactly an Eleanor Dashwood type character, but more of like the ideal heroine of like, but a lot of the things that Jane Austen kind of wrote against in a way, but perfect and caring and kind, and quiet and self-effacing, which you do see those traits in somebody like Fanny Price, and kind of he takes that and says, well, what happens to this kind, caring and soft-hearted person when they are married and go through the trials of life, and you know, how does that work out for them compared to the character who's a bit more vicious?
That's interesting. It's what will Jane Bennet's life be like?
Exactly. Jane Bennet is a good example for it. What would Jane Bennet's life be like if she didn't marry Mr. Bingley, but married somebody less well off?
Less well off. Yeah. So, moving on.
Yes. Proceed.
Next prompt is to read some non-fiction related to Jane Austen and Austen's life, world, times, and I read A Fine Brush on Ivory, an appreciation of Jane Austen by Richard Jenkyns, which was a lovely book. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it, I think, because he's a sort of literary, you know, academic who really loves Austen, and that sort of bleeds through the page, you know, and he's so
that you get that enthusiasm,
and he's prepared to be opinionated about some bits in some of the books in an enjoyable way. It's one of those books that I would say read it when you've read all the major novels, a bit like the John Mullan.
Which I reread, What Matters in Jane Austen by John Mullan. Weaker than I remembered, and I remember thinking when I read it that it was weaker than what other people had made it sound to be. But
and funnily enough, I think his Dickens one is
better.
Yeah. So it's just it's like confirmation bias. You know, I think it was a 5-star book for me, and I think that was because basically I agreed with it a lot.
Yeah. The other thing that I read was Modern Critics on Jane Austen, which was a book that we picked up in a charity shop last year, published in about the 1960s. So when you're saying Modern Critics on Jane Austen, I read like an article by C.S. Lewis where he talks about Jane Austen's sort of quieter heroines. I also read one about Emma where it talks about kind of the class dimensions in Ivory, and you know the situation with like the Coles and they're kind of like the upward momentum that you're seeing from like the Coles, Mrs. Elton, and the conflict that throws into the Highbury society that's kind of established in a certain way. But yeah, so I found that interesting, but yeah, not very modern.
Yeah, but it is testimony to the way, like every generation wants to write about Austen. Yeah. Now,
and responds differently to different aspects as well.
Next prompt is
to read a modern retelling,
which neither of us did. Now, at the end of last year's Jane Austen, I forswore ever reading another modern retelling of Jane Austen.
I didn't.
So, what's your excuse?
No, I just I meant to order one from the internet, and I didn't order it in time. But moving swiftly on to something that we did do is the next. Well, the next one, there's two. One that we didn't do is to watch a modernised adaptation of an Austen film, and I didn't this year, although I have enjoyed some previously. But I suppose like to watch a true adaptation, as in a theoretically a close adaptation, is the final prompt.
And I had a plan.
You had a plan. Tell me your plan.
But my plan was to read the 2022
watch
the 2022 Persuasion
on Netflix. Dakota Johnson. Yeah.
And I was all lined up to do that. Yeah.
And I watched it, and
I just thought,
yeah. And there's a lot. You can see a lot of specific reviews of this adaptation of Persuasion. So
and why it's rubbish.
I don't want to go on for too long, but there's a couple of kind of key points. It's the tone of Persuasion. Although there is a lot of humour in it, it's a lot of quite dark, bleak humour. There's not a lot of a kind of slapstick comedy in the original Persuasion. Although there are a few people falling over, they're not really played for laughs. And the style of filmmaking, I think it would have been spot on for Pride and Prejudice. I think it would have worked potentially for Emma. You can really see Elizabeth Bennet interrupting a dinner party to say something embarrassing if she thought that it was going to stop her mum saying something more embarrassing.
Yeah.
Anne Elliot interrupting a dinner party to say something embarrassing, it just doesn't work for the character. And a little bit of, it's hard to get at Anne Elliot's inner world, and I think that's what a lot of adaptations have struggled with, like getting Anne's internal emotions.
Yeah, because she's quite a reserved character, which is why I think I really love that book.
Yeah. So having her talking to the camera in a way you can see it making sense, but the way that it manages her talking to the camera, it's just the wrong kind of humour for Persuasion.
So that convinced me not to watch it.
It takes out some of the more complex elements. One of the really resonant things about Persuasion, and one of the things that makes it such a good love story, is that Anne and Wentworth, in this stage of their relationship, they have no time on their own together. So the only time when they're on their own together is when one of the Musgrove sisters is asleep in the coach with them. That's the closest they come to having an intimate conversation, a private conversation. It just doesn't happen. Whereas in this film, they suddenly have like all of these moments where they're having these private conversations and they're basically talking about the fact that they're exes. It's just not. It doesn't fit with the romantic power of the story. And the point is, they know each other so well that they know that they're in love by the end of it.
And that would take the tension away, because the tension is, how will they get over this misunderstanding that we know they're both still in love, but they're not quite sure about each other, and that's the story. That's the plot.
And there we
go.
The other aspect is maybe seems like more of a trivial thing. But in the book, we have this conflict between Louisa and Henrietta Musgrove as to who is going to end up with Captain Wentworth, which obviously doesn't end up being the thing.
Yeah.
But they take that out. They take away the conflict between Louisa and Henrietta, and they make it a conflict between Louisa and Anne, and they make Louisa aware of Anne's previous relationship, which it doesn't fit with the book in that in the book Anne's really got to deal with it all on her own, and it also doesn't fit with the wider kind of themes of Jane Austen, where she spends a lot of time looking at kind of siblings as competitors in romance. There's a lot of, like, in Sense and Sensibility, there's all these moments when you're thinking, is Eleanor potentially going to end up with Colonel Brandon? Because that would in many ways be a better match.
A better match.
You've got in Pride and Prejudice, you've got like Mr. Collins going from sister to sister. You've got, and sometimes it's kind of played for laughs, as in, like, you know, are siblings interchangeable? And sometimes it is kind of like a genuine conflict, not necessarily conflict is the wrong word, but a genuine debate between, like, which sibling is going to be better. And you have that multiple times in Persuasion, because you have the Mary marrying Charles Musgrove when Charles Musgrove originally liked Anne. You have Mr. Elliot being supposed to be a suitor for Elizabeth Elliot, and he's actually kind of a suitor for Anne Elliot. And just to take out that sister conflict dimension, I didn't see any reason to change the plot in that way. I just didn't feel like it worked.
So, like all the rest of the world, you panned it and I didn't, and so I didn't watch it. But you consoled yourself by watching a couple of others, didn't you?
Yeah, well, I watched Emma 2020, and that's also really bad. It's my husband's favourite Jane Austen book, Emma.
I thought you were going to say it's his favourite adaptation. I was thinking, no.
And we watched it together, and it was just like, it just makes it so boring. It just takes out so much of the dynamism that you get from Emma as a book, which not a lot happens in Emma as a book, but it feels like a lot does.
It feels like a lot does because it's in a very small world, so small incidents are big.
Yeah, and it just makes it kind of dull, and then it messes up with a lot of the kind of romantic tension and structures of it.
Someone out there will disagree with us. Someone out there will like
it's a very pretty adaptation, and the same with the modern Persuasion. Actually, if you're going to say anything in praise of it, is that it aesthetically is very pleasing, but it just doesn't, you know.
So we should wind up.
And I also, to console myself again, because obviously having watched these two awful adaptations, I watched the 2008 Sense and Sensibility, which is one of the best Austen adaptations available. If you haven't watched it, I would really strongly recommend it.
It is. It's up there for me with the very best Pride and Prejudice, which obviously is the one with Jen Freely and Colin Firth.
Yeah, and what it does well is it actually manages to show us some of those inner worlds. So it shows us a bit of Eleanor Dashwood's conflict in almost better than the book does in a way. In terms of, it brings out things that Jane Austen mentions and makes it obvious to a modern viewer.
There we go. So we had a lovely Jane Austen July. Hope you did too. And feel free to disagree with all our opinions.
Comments and discuss it further. Thank you for watching.
And hope there wasn't too much noise off. I think it's getting noisier. Yeah.